Good morning and very welcome to our series about understanding economics with macroeconomist Mr. Helmo Preus. Very welcome.
Good morning.
He made a presentation just yesterday to the, if I must disclose.
Yeah, you can disclose.
To the Bank of Namibia about the Namibian economy. Or
no, South African economy.
South African economy. And probably also about the impact on to some extent.
To some extent, yes.
On the Namibian economy. So today we're going to look on the some economic indicators given the situation that Russia have, based on PPP, purchasing power parity, if I'm correct.
Correct.
Have surpassed Japan as the biggest economy. The fourth biggest economy. And that is given despite the Western narrative that Russia's economy is declining because of the Ukraine war and all the money invested in the military and so on. So is it possible that you can maybe just explain that, or how did it happen that PPP is considered as an important indicator for measuring the size of an economy compared to other indicators? If you can just maybe elaborate on that.
Right. Your problem in terms of measuring GDP, you've got one in terms of nominal and then deflated to US dollars in order to get a comparison. And some currencies are undervalued, like the Namibian dollar, because that's tied to the South African rand, and they're both undervalued. To try and get around that to a certain extent, you had the Big Mac index that said, all right, a Big Mac is the same in whether it's in Russia or in America or in Japan or in Namibia. But there are differences there, and it's easier to raise cattle in Namibia than it is to raise cattle in Japan, for instance. So there are distortions even when you take a Big Mac. So what people have then come up with is a power purchasing parity concept, where you say, all right, one measure of labor, for instance, is the same as another measure of labor, and then try and say, all right, on this basis, then Russia, even if you measure it on a, say, US dollar basis, would be eighth. Once you have purchasing power parity, then it moves up to fourth. In the same way, if you look at China, if you look at it at a purchasing power parity, it's probably bigger than that of America, and on the same basis. But it is fairly intricate, and the statistical agencies do try and show how purchasing power parity impacts on their economy.
Can you, if it's possible, just briefly explain to me how is the purchasing power, or what are the variables or the most important variables playing a role in determining the PPP, and also with reference to the Big Mac that you said is the, as I understand, is the most comparable indicator, but also some reservations.
Yes, as I said, it's easier to raise cattle, and that's what goes into a Big Mac. Also in terms of wheat for the bun in certain countries compared to other countries. So there is no direct comparison, even though the final product is the same.
Yeah.
It is because you have natural resource and endowment that you have variations. And in order to overcome that, normally you look at how much unit of labor is required to buy a basket of goods.
Obviously, the less you use, the more productive, and therefore,
So that's how you try and create a level playing field, as it were.
Okay. Then, if we look at the GDP as a, can we say, not comprehensive indicator of the size of the economy, and how does it differ from the PPP?
Well, you deflate via purchasing power what you have established as your gross domestic product. So the statistical agencies will add all the various components of the economy together. However, even that is a measure. For instance, if you look at housework done by housewives and childcare and things like that, if it's done within the family, that's not measured in terms of GDP. Whereas if you pay for somebody to look after your child, that's then measured in terms of the economy. So GDP measurement is not exact, but it's an estimate, and it's there. There's a whole system of national accounts that tries to make sure that everybody uses the same way of measuring the economy, so that you can do cross-country comparisons.
Okay, so there are ways, and what accuracy would you say it has, given the differences between the different countries? Are we talking about 10, 20, or 30% inaccuracy, or the other way?
The more you have in terms of informal economy that's not measured, the bigger your difference in terms of being an underestimate of the size of the economy. And as I said, things like childcare, doing washing and laundry and baking that you do in the house, that's not measured because you're not paying for it.
Yeah.
So the more the informal, the larger the discrepancy between actual and measured economies.
So if we look at the African economy, you mentioned, I think, a critical point about the size of the informal economy, that it's very difficult to measure. And given Africa, where we have large informal economies, to what extent are these figures not included in determining the size of African economies or countries within Africa compared to Western economies, and how accurate or inaccurate?
There's a sizable. So in the case of South Africa, for instance, statistics, South Africa estimates the informal economy at around about 8%, because there's you do have large cash and you can track it better.
Yeah.
But in other economies, let's say in Zimbabwe or even Namibia, I guess the informal economy is closer to 30% there. So that's the underestimate. The problem is because it's not measured, to try and say this is how much it is, that's just a thumbsuck. So you do have, on occasions, you do have surveys that try and estimate the non-measured economy.
But it's much better measured in South Africa. That's why you can say with more certainty, or closer to the ballpark, that it's 8%.
Yeah, that's what
compared to Namibia, where we do polls or surveys very not even once a year.
No. So even in South Africa, your non-measured economy, and remember, apart from the informal side, there's also the illicit side in terms of avoiding taxes, so smuggling of cigarettes, and the estimates there are fairly high as well. So
if it's the case that the informal economy plays a bigger role, if you look at China, where you have also a substantial informal economy at once, I don't know about the current situation, but formally, 10 years ago and 20 years ago, did it change dramatically from informal to more formal in China? And do you have any figure about the size of the estimated informal economy in China or India?
In terms of China, China is much more digitally enhanced economy than South Africa or Namibia. So it's easier for the statistical agencies to track all those digital transactions. So the size of, in terms of subsistence, would be probably in the case of China closer to 5%, rather than in any large number that. And that probably applies to any advanced economy because that 5% covers the illicit, the drug dealing, the prostitution, and things like that, where there are cash transactions, but it is a kind of economic activity.
To what extent is money laundering from illicit to licit, or to legalize it, part of the informal economy and part of the formal economy, and what difference does it make in a country that's extremely corrupt with a lot of money laundering that's just guesswork in terms of the size?
Well, and that's where your illicit problems come in. For instance, in my last weekly economic briefing, the estimate for the trade in gold smuggling in Africa was 35 billion. That's a fair, and that's US dollars, not Namibian dollars. Yeah. So it is fair, and that's on an annual basis.
For planning purposes, is it the purpose of central planners to change and to make it possible for people to change from an informal economy to become part of a formal economy, so that they can pay tax and they can be statistically numbered for planning purposes?
Yeah, that's where the revenue services or other place try and make it less cash-based, so things moving into a digital economy so that they can track what's happening, and that's really to get more revenue in, and but it also is there to stop money laundering and to stop terrorist financing.
Yeah.
So there's and one of the reasons why South Africa is grey listed at the moment, because we have loopholes there,
as well as Namibia. Yeah, we have the situation here that with FIA requirements, that even churches are required that can apply for exemption. Even associations. What is the regulation 2021? Institutions like EPRA need to have applied for exemption from FIA requirements. I mean, and there was a huge outcry against it, and they're still in the process of that. And is it so that it is purely as a result of the FIA requirements, or do you see it from, or could it be also from a government perspective to get more control over the economy?
And governments want more control over the economy in order to try and estimate the size of the economy, and also to prevent terrorist financing and money laundering. So there are urgent requirements in terms of having those regulations in place. So, but there is also a problem in terms of privacy and legitimate concerns about that as well.
Yeah, here in Namibia, and the churches are relatively much smaller than South Africa in terms of the size of the economy. So we have our reservations in general about the applicability of FIA in terms of small churches for money laundering purposes. But in South Africa, I suppose it can be different.
Not really, but the governments also, generally speaking, don't like non-governmental organisations. In the case of South Africa, in the apartheid era, a lot of money was channeled to the ANC via church organisations. So, but unfortunately, while that was happening, then corrupt people then took advantage of that and put some of their money that was meant for other purposes into their own pockets.
Yeah. So, okay. If one can, since we're talking about GDP per capita, can be considered as a very crude measure for Namibia's case. We are classified as a middle-income country based on our GDP per capita, if I'm correct. And the late president also said, but it's unfair because we have such a skewed distribution of income in Namibia. But given our GDP per capita, we're a middle-income country, and therefore we don't qualify for more assistance, which is not necessarily good or bad. because it can create a dependency syndrome, as we have seen in the rest of the world and in Africa. Are there better ways, or how do you think, how long will the GDP per capita still being the flavor of the years to come as a measure of income of a person in a country?
It is skewed, and the more unequal your society is, the more it's skewed. So you can make adjustments in terms of that, and you can certainly say it's unfair. We shouldn't be valued on this basis, and we should have other measurements. But as I said, in terms of GDP, it's an inexact measure, but it's a basic estimate that we do have. And you've got to remember as well, it's relatively new and only started after the Second World War, compiling GDP data. So we haven't got a long history in terms of that. But it is being refined. Roughly every 10 years, there's a new publication of the system of national accounts.
Okay. And the GDP per capita is who are the bigger contributors in order for changing it, or the process of evolution? Is it the economists in general? Is it the UN economists? Is it the World Bank? Where is the biggest drive for changing it or evolving it is coming?
Well, I think low-income countries where you've got large changes, so for instance, if you've got an oil-rich country with a low population, and where it's not distributed equally,
like in
Nigeria or some of the Middle East Gulf states, then you would say that's not applicable there. But just because the wealth is so much in terms of the oil there, there's no chance of them really being put down into middle income from being high income.
Yeah. Okay. Any other indicators except the GDP and PPP that you would consider as very important if you look at the size or the of any economy? Well, what are you looking at?
Well,
economists.
Yeah, the other one that people should be looking at is the Human Development Indicator, which is a basket that the United Nations do. And that looks at things like life expectancy, food security, and other things like that. So if you're doing cost country from a developmental economics point of view, the Human Development Indicator is a better indicator than a GDP per capita.
Okay. Economic growth and economic development. Which one would you say come first, or are they both equally important?
I would say economic growth is more important than economic development, because with the growth you get development, and you need so the focus should be on economic growth, growing the cake larger before you worry about redistribution.
Yeah. So is it possible to say that, given that specific statement, it's more inclined towards creating the living standards of people in the process of economic growth, in the process, but profit first before you can make any adjustments or distributions?
Yeah. So if you look at the rise of China in terms of that, they looked at growing the economy, and they weren't worried about how to grow the economy, whether it was a capitalist system or socialist system or
same Singapore, you know.
Yeah. And what you then have is the trickle down effect that actually works in those cases. But you need at least 3 times population growth for that to be effective. And so that's why growth should be your number one priority, making sure that you get triple population growth.
Are you referring to 3 times population growth, like in 300%?
Yeah, so if
a baseline, a low base.
Yeah, if we take the example of South Africa, population growth rate is 1.5%. We should be aiming as a minimum at 4.5%. That should be your aim year in, year out.
Okay.
And in the case of China, they had a one-child policy, so their population growth rate was low at 0.2%. In recent years, actually been negative.
Yeah.
Yet they have had growth double digits for 2 decades, and now moving down into 8% and then going down to 5%.
Okay, so it is possible to say, if I'm correct, that China still have the fastest, biggest growth rate?
Not at the moment. Not for this year. So growth rate in China would be 5%. India would be growing at 8%. So in India, if you're looking at purely in terms of how much growth they're getting, but remember, India's is where China was in 2007.
Yeah.
So
baseline is much lower.
So they've got some catch up to do.
Yeah. For how many years do you foresee? And I may say, probably impossible question to answer. You think America will still maintain its position in terms of the overall size of the economy? Although China have surpassed them in PPP terms, but in GDP terms, not necessarily.
No, not necessarily. And the thing that you've got to remember about America is its dynamism. And so if you look at the number of patents and the number of Nobel prizes that the Americans gain, that will keep them going. And that's the problem in terms of China, is that the last 3 or 4 years, the entrepreneurial that has driven America has been dampened down in China. It's much more state-driven now than being individual.
Yes. Is it possible to say from what you are saying, and I don't want to lay words in your mouth, but the importance of freedom of speech and for that to test your products and services in the market in America is far. I mean that's far. It cannot be compared to the situation in a communist country like China or Russia. Probably less in China because if the market's regulated and controlled by the government, obviously you will not have the same type of freedom of speech and the ability to test your market or your product or services in the markets in case there is an economic slowdown. But in America, with so much research ongoing, when there's an economic slowdown or economic collapse in one specific system, and then there are already a lot of products and services that have been tested already that come onto the market much quicker compared to in a communist system that where you have that lack or gap, to put it that way.
If you look at China and Russia, where the state says, all right, we want to focus on these kind of efforts, the state is actually pretty good, and to a certain extent America is following that in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, is saying we've lost a lot of our capacity to make and design our own semiconductors, so we're hauling that back onto American shores. It was in a way outsourced to China and Taiwan. It's been and in the same way, China, in terms of superconductors, have been buying with America for the last decade. It's one gets a bit of ahead of the other, and so they are competitive in terms of that. The problem with the sort of state-directed is the other small shoots that, for instance, led to the iPhone wouldn't be possible under the Chinese system or the Russian system, because that's outside state control. And we're focusing now on AI coming to the forefront, where the state is involved in China or Russia. Yes, there's a lot of resources thrown at it, but what about biokinetics and biochemistry that may be neglected? And where are the obesity drugs that comes from Denmark, which is a very small country? So if you tampen down and stop the entrepreneurial spirits that you would have in Russia or China, then you take something away. Now, how much that opportunity cost is, we don't know. But it is there.
Yeah. Okay. So in this video, we've looked at the GDP and the PPP and the human development indicators. Any final words on any other indicators do you think that will become important in future, or that is emerging?
Well, there's another indicator called the happiness indicator. It's similar to the human development indicator, and that's a bit more fuzzy in terms of that, but it's useful if you're looking at a whole economy point of view to take that into account as well. And so, what's the concept of having sunlight, for most of your year? How important is that to you? And quality of air, etc.
Yeah. At which other indicators do investors look? Do they look at these indicators or other indicators before investing?
Harvard has done a lot of studies into what makes some economies successful and other economies less successful. And the one indicator that they say trumps all others is rule of law. If you have certainty that your invention doesn't get taken away by somebody else.
Contract, right.
If you have the rule of law, that's the number. So if you have a anarchy and civil war in a country, there's no rule of law. It's the power of the gun
that includes also property
rights. And includes property rights as well.
And together with the freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech per se is not a requirement. Rule of law is more a requirement than freedom of speech.
Based on the Harvard study.
Based on the Harvard study. Okay. So, they take the Freedom House indicator in terms of democracy, and that's part of what they look at. What makes it successful, and rule of law beats all other indicators.
And then by saying that, they also mean to some extent the judicial system is a little bit more independent.
Yes, yes. So, and as we saw now with Trump, nobody is above the law. He's been convicted of 34 counts of felonies, so he will face a sentencing. Whether he's an ex-president or not doesn't come into the equation.
Okay, and that again ties into democracy, and although you can also abuse the rule of law, I mean, given the
what you then try in terms of that is you try and write laws that favour you, but it's the rule of law, so it has to have an independent judiciary as well.
Okay. Well, that concludes then this video. Thank you very much, Mr. Preus, for your explanation of some of the most important indicators from economic size and also from economic investor point of view. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.